Just to let you know, we'll be starting in 2 minutes. We're just waiting for a few of our guests to be admitted in the virtual lobby, and we'll be starting in 2 minutes. A reminder to please mute all your microphones, and an update that this session will be live streamed on Facebook and Twitter through the DIRCO pages. So apologies for the slightly delayed start, and we will start shortly. Thank you.
He's not dealing well with it. And I'm like,
okay, I'll be in his corner because Swaz is too rational.
Honorable Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Dr. Naledi Pandor, Ms. Nardos Bekele-Thomas, the United Nations Resident Coordinator in South Africa, Professor Tawana Coupe, Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Pretoria, and Ms. Elizabeth Cideropolis, Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs. To all those who have joined us, our audience, encompassing the cross-section of society, the diplomatic corps, media, civil society, government, the United Nations, the corporate sector, and everybody in between, a very good morning. My name is Sudesh Reddy. I'm the Communications Specialist at UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, and welcome to this morning's webinar titled The Importance of Multilateralism in Building Back Better in a Post-COVID World. This is a morning of an energizing discussion as we reflect on 75 years of the United Nations. We look forward to your thoughts and inputs in the chat box following the presentations. It's a beautiful day here in Pretoria. The jacaranda are in full bloom, so we have much to smile about. We hope the gods of technology will be on our side today and that all will work smoothly in this COVID world of Zoom and virtual meetings. So we're delighted to see so many of you here. The program envisages being around an hour and a half. We will have a short video on the United Nations work over this period of COVID in South Africa. That will be followed by a welcome by our hosts from DIRCO and the United Nations. And there will then be a panel discussion where our four specialists will speak on the theme, and together they collectively have remarkable expertise and an unmatched lived experience. And thereafter, we'll have a chance to raise questions and make comments in the chat box. So we look forward to an energizing and invigorating morning. And we will now start with a 4-minute video produced by the United Nations in South Africa. We can just put the video on. Thank you. There seems to be a sound glitch.
Sorry, bear with me.
It's okay. It's to be expected in these times. I think we've all been there. Joys of Murphy's Law when these situations happen, but we will get through this.
South Africa reported its first case of the COVID-19 pandemic in early March 2020. Since then, it has become the epicenter of the pandemic on the African continent, with the number of cases and deaths continuing to rise. Under the leadership of the resident coordinator, Ms. Nardos Bekele-Thomas, the United Nations in South Africa response to the pandemic was dynamic, as the country office responded collectively as one UN, while the 17 entities also used their specific agency mandates to provide expertise on targeted issues. As the World Health Organization led the fight against the pandemic globally, the World Health Organization's South Africa office was actively involved in assisting government by fielding dozens of experts to work at multiple levels with the government and national and provincial health teams. Their assistance was felt at every level of managing the pandemic, from the Command Council to contact tracing, as well as providing much-needed training in the health sector. In April this year, the United Nations in South Africa launched an emergency flash appeal for $136 million to support close to 10 million people in need. The appeal will help fund the civil society response and ensure that the needs of key populations and vulnerable communities are met in the response to COVID-19, including continued health support to people living with HIV, migrants and refugees, women and children affected by violence, and communities facing shortages of food and other essentials. On gender-based violence, agencies including UN Women and the UN Population Fund, or UNFPA, played a critical role in raising awareness, disseminating information, and by engaging with civil society, youth groups, and the government to encourage those affected by the scourge to seek help. These agencies also developed innovative methods to reach out to communities on issues related to sexual and reproductive health. Rising unemployment led to further food insecurity and exacerbated already dire situations for many communities. UNICEF used their Buckets of Care campaign to encourage those who were in a position to help to donate about 800 rands or $50, which would feed a family of 4. In addition, the agency continues to work with partners in building hand washing stations in impoverished communities, especially as hand hygiene is a critical factor in the fight against COVID-19. The International Labour Organization provides technical support to government on labor issues and also contributed to a global ILO video reflecting the way in which the world of work has changed due to COVID-19 as telecommuting became the new norm. The UN Refugee Agency and the International Organization on Migration remained active in assisting the migrant and refugee communities in South Africa as they too felt the impact of the pandemic. UNHCR teamed up with the World Food Programme in sounding alarm bells related to food insecurity amidst funding shortages during this time of crisis. UNAIDS has worked with partners to coordinate the United Nations in South Africa plan, providing support to strategic information. Funds already available to the United Nations Joint Team on HIV/AIDS have been reprogrammed to ensure that civil society, people living with HIV, key populations, and vulnerable communities continue to be supported in the AIDS response while also addressing new challenges from COVID-19. The media shone the spotlight on the spread of COVID-19 across the country as prisoners too were not exempt from the spread of the virus despite being isolated from communities. The UN Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights played a critical role in encouraging government to consider 19,000 prisoners for parole as overcrowding in prisons posed a risk to social distancing and thus further spread of the virus. The United Nations South Africa used its voice to show solidarity with the government and the people of the country as they continue to fight against the pandemic through the use of public service announcements and the dissemination of information material in various official languages. UN agencies, including the UN Development Programme and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, to name a few, continue to work with the government on economic challenges in the face of the pandemic and to provide personal protective equipment and other essential items to healthcare workers, government, and communities. The United Nations in South Africa continues to use multiple platforms and its relationship with government and partners across all sectors to play a critical role on the ground in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic.
The COVID-19 pandemic requires us all to take action, leaving no one behind. We support the government of South Africa and urge you to observe the United Nations in South Africa stands with you.
Interferencia. Ordenadores potentes, ¿eh?
Thank you. Could I ask everybody to please mute your mics? Thank you for that, and apologies for the technical glitch at the end. Seldom 100% smooth effort, but we will continue to do our best for the course of this morning. I would now like to call on the Honourable Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Dr. Naledi Pandor, to give us a few words of welcome. Today's seminar is being hosted by DIRCO and the United Nations, and we feel particularly privileged that you, Minister, have been able to join us this morning and share with us your thoughts, which we will have in the panel discussion thereafter. But really, thank you for availing yourself at an extremely busy time, both in the country and globally. So, Mr. Pando, we look forward to hearing your welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Program Director, UN Resident Coordinator, Ms. Nardos Berkeley Thomas, Professor Tawana Kupe, Vice Chancellor and Principal, University of Pretoria, Ms. Elizabeth Cideropolis, Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, and Chief Executive, I'm still waiting for my invitation to visit the Institute. Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps and the United Nations country team in South Africa, and all who are joining us this morning, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to warmly welcome all of you to this joint DIRCO United Nations webinar with the theme, The Importance of Multilateralism in Building Back Better for a Post-COVID-19 World. The webinar that we're holding today is part of marking the diamond anniversary of the entry into force of the UN Charter around 24th of October 1945. All of you would be aware that there have been a number of commemorative events marking this very important anniversary. At the high-level event of the 75th anniversary of the UN, held in September, a political declaration was adopted, reaffirming the global commitment of all of us to multilateralism. The declaration very aptly concludes with these words: "We will work together with partners to strengthen coordination and global governance for the common future of present and coming generations." So as we wish the United Nations well into the future, let us also recommit ourselves individually and organizationally to the ideals of the Charter. Annually, DIRCO and the United Nations office in Pretoria host joint events to mark United Nations Day. Unfortunately, this year, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we could not meet physically since large gatherings are still prohibited. So we decided we must mark this occasion and opted to host a joint webinar to commemorate United Nations Day. When we gathered last year to celebrate the formation of the United Nations, I'm sure none of us imagined that the world would be engulfed by a common enemy of such immensity. COVID-19 pandemic, which has now claimed more than 1 million lives around the globe, deepened poverty, widened the inequality gap, increased insecurity, and revealed deep cracks in the system of global governance. So what the pandemic has done is remind us of the work we still have to do. The pandemic has awfully caused us to recall the indispensable value of multilateralism. We have seen that, as with other contemporary challenges, no country acting alone can successfully deal with the pandemic. While commendable multilateral cooperation between states has been witnessed, the pandemic has also raised the question of how we should organize the world in its aftermath. I trust that today's panel discussion will help suggest practical ways to build back better for a post-COVID-19 world. I've repeated often that should we be visited by a pandemic once again, Africa must not be found in the position in which it was found by the pandemic. A post-COVID-19 world should be one that is increasingly free of conflict. It should also be a world that is increasingly free of poverty. It should be a world increasingly free of inequality and underdevelopment. A world of inclusive economic growth and shared prosperity. And it should be a world where young people are able to grow and thrive, and where women and girls enjoy equal rights and equal opportunities. I'm thus hopeful that this webinar will allow us sufficient time to delve into this theme in detail, with the intention of emerging with concrete ideas that can then provide us with succinct goals for South Africa's multilateral engagements in this ever-changing world, and for future initiatives that we would undertake with our colleagues of the United Nations based in South Africa. So with those few remarks and the hope that we will build back better, let me welcome you all and thank you for this opportunity. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Minister Pandor, for your words of welcome. Indeed, in a pre-COVID world, we would have had the session in your wonderful DIRCO building, the OR Tambo building, but we will make do with virtual for now. And indeed, thanks for reminding us about how indispensable multilateralism is. I think that will be the theme for this throughout this thread of discussion this morning. Another short welcome will be delivered by the United Nations Resident Coordinator to South Africa, Ms. Nardos Bekele-Thomas.
Thank you very much, Sudesh. Your Excellency, good morning, my sister, Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Dr. Naledi Pandor, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Pretoria, Professor Tawana Kupe, my brother, the Chief Executive of the South Africa Institute for International Affairs, Ms. Elizabeth Cideropolis, Excellencies, ambassadors and members of the Diplomatic Corps, leaders of our civil society organizations, captains of industries, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Honorable Minister Pandor, on this occasion of this commemorative event, and on behalf of the UN country team, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the government of South Africa for its unwavering support to the United Nations and its commitment to the principles of multilateralism. It's a pleasure and a privilege to join you all virtually for this most timely event. In 2020, 75 years after the world unified to champion multilateralism, nations are compelled to come together once again at a time of grief, anger, and despair caused by the COVID-19 pandemic to say, never again will we allow ourselves to weaken in the face of any similar crisis. It's critical for the United Nations, an organization that believes in the values of justice, human rights, and the rule of law, to continue to speak on the need to have solidarity, the need to come together, and the need for multilateralism to conquer our common enemies. In the way countries have come together to fight against poverty, inequality, discrimination, racism, and apartheid, this is the time for all nations, without any exception, to rally together to fight the current enemy of COVID-19 and the causes that have weakened us from having the resilience to withstand such crises. We therefore have to stand firm to implement the Sustainable Development Goals established in 2015 and commit to building a resilient, all-inclusive and sustainable development for all. The impact of COVID-19, ladies and gentlemen, will be felt for years to come. But there were also the pre-COVID challenges of sustained economic slowdown, high unemployment, climate emergency, entrenched and systemic racism, gender inequality, and oppression, all too complex and multifaceted for any one nation to tackle on its own. Therefore, multilateralism matters to all states, big or small. It's been often said that if the UN did not exist, we would have to create it. But the UN does exist, and now is the time to strengthen it and build back better. With all the analytical capacities, technical and technological know-how, we can reform the UN and make it fit for purpose. Let's unite together. On behalf of the UN country team, I would like to thank the government of South Africa and in particular DIRCO for co-hosting this event. I look forward to an engaging and inspiring session. Thank you very much and welcome all.
Thank you, Resident Coordinator, for those words of welcome. And we will now get into the nitty-gritty, as they say, of the discussion around multilateralism and building back better in a post-COVID world. I'm going to call on our four panelists individually. They will each deliver a few-minute presentation, about 4 to 5 minutes. And after that, we will then have time for a discussion period. So if I could first ask Minister Pandor to come to address us. Just a little bit about Minister Pandor for those who don't know, but I think most of us do. Minister Naledi Pandor has been a member of Parliament since 1994, so since the dawn of democracy, has served as the Deputy Chairperson and Chairperson of the National Council of Provinces. She has served as Minister of Education, Minister of Home Affairs, Minister of Science and Technology, and Minister of Higher Education and Training, and is now our Minister of International Relations and Cooperation. Minister Pandor has a PhD from the University of Pretoria and several honorary doctorates as well. But more than that, you have championed multilateralism consistently throughout your various portfolios. So thank you for joining us and hosting us this morning, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Reddy. I want to begin my remarks by referring to perhaps something that has become a huge hope for me that I really would like to pursue. In the beginning of the pandemic, we as South Africa started by marshalling our public health resources, getting the system ready and preparing essentially to respond to patients. When the cases began to rise, the government realized that much more needed to be done and that we would have to introduce restrictions, hence the first very strict lockdown. When the lockdown occurred and several other Africans introduced one at the same time, one of the things that struck me was the economic impact on women, particularly on women that work at the margins of our national economies, those that are in the so-called micro and informal sector. And I noticed how little support these women enjoy from formal finance and business financing institutions. So my wish in building back better is that we should have definitive interventions and programs to offer those women greater support and security, because they are a bulwark to poverty in many of our countries, and they're totally neglected and without support. So those are just my preliminary remarks, because this hit me so hard as we entered this very difficult period. Now to my actual remarks. Well, South Africa, as a democracy, very young, 26 years old, is a country that holds very tightly to the notion of multilateralism and to the importance of its membership of the international community. It is for this reason and this strong sentiment that we are always happy to observe United Nations Day in October each year, which marks this important anniversary of the entry into force of the UN Charter. Countries that put their stamp to the UN Charter, we believe, really sought to reimagine a world where nations were choosing cooperation over conflict, where friendly relations would lead to social progress, cooperation, and development, to the observance and enjoyment of human rights, and to a better life for all people. Having been part of a country in which resolution of conflict by peaceful means has become so important, I am often terribly dismayed at the conflicts that we see around our continent and in many different parts of the world, because it is, I know, very plausible to resolve conflict by peaceful means. So these noble ideas were part of the United Nations, and I hope they will guide our country for decades to come. We, of course, are significant beneficiaries of the efforts of the United Nations as it began against the system of apartheid as soon as its establishment. Member states such as India warned late in the 1940s that if the belief that there is to be one standard of treatment for white races and another for non-whites, if this belief continues to gain strength among the white communities, the future for solidarity among members of the United Nations and the future, consequently, for world peace will indeed be dark. This was said by India at the inception of this wonderful organization. From 1950, the UN General Assembly began to adopt a number of resolutions against apartheid South Africa. In 1963, the United Nations established a special committee against apartheid, which played an important role in mobilizing international solidarity against apartheid South Africa and the eventual suspension of South Africa from the United Nations in 1974. Our story of transition from apartheid to democracy illustrates humanity's great capacity for justice, for courage and hope, all of which are values and principles upon which the United Nations was founded. The UN continues to be a platform for other struggles against oppression, war, and global injustice. We believe that given this and it being the only organization that can advance these global struggles, we have to strengthen our efforts to ensure complete global decolonization, including working hard at achieving the right to self-determination of the people of Palestine and the people of Western Sahara. So while apartheid South Africa, with great resolve, great effort, has been overcome, we still have areas of the world, and we must not tire in our efforts to address these. Since our freedom, we have pursued and taken up responsibilities as an active member of the United Nations, and it is our intention that we will never disappoint the UN. We've sought to participate in all aspects of this great organization's activities, including by serving in its principal organs. Our actions derive from our firm belief in multilateralism, particularly the development of a global governance system which is fair, equitable, and representative. We believe in the promotion of peace and security through global disarmament. We believe in promoting good governance, in promoting human rights, access for all, and we think we have to wage a far bigger fight against poverty through promoting sustainable development. It is our view that this 75th anniversary comes at a crucial moment when multilateralism and a rules-based international order are challenged. For us, the UN remains the foundation of a multilateral system of governance, which, and I stress, despite some flaws, has ensured that countries are able to convene to discuss and promote matters of international peace and security, human rights, and development. While we laud the UN as a global multilateral organization, we do recognize that its makeup is somewhat undemocratic and not fully in all its organs of a very changed world since its creation. And so we do argue for reform of the United Nations, but the principles that we wish to pursue and the objectives remain clearly articulated in the UN Charter. We believe that we should work to create a stronger United Nations, one that is responsive, adaptable, and able to address challenges, while also fulfilling its mandate and objectives as elaborated in the UN Charter, which we really insist must be the cornerstone of international law. It is our belief that the United Nations should become subject to the political interests of any particular country, that it is only through drawing on the strength of the collective, through genuine multilateral cooperation, that complex challenges are solved. We also believe one of the objectives that the United Nations should look at embracing, as we learn from the experience of COVID-19, is the objective of ensuring digital inclusion, as our digital inequality has been exposed in a very, very apparent way by the ability of some of us to resort to virtual communication, and for many of us to be totally excluded from communication. Our roadmap to recovery has to include the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. This set of goals will assist us in eradicating poverty and ensuring a better life for all the world's population. We have seen very, very exciting initiatives on the African continent as it implemented a collective response to coronavirus. Its creation of an Africa-funded COVID-19 response fund and the launching of the groundbreaking African medical supplies platform to ensure that all have access to medical equipment have been historic initiatives enacted in collaboration by Africa. However, the pandemic has set back our development aspirations. So we need to do much more as we call for support for the following. We need a comprehensive economic stimulus package for Africa. We need to have a longer-term suspension of interest payments on Africa's external and public debt. And we need to have sanctions lifted against countries such as Zimbabwe and Sudan to allow them to respond to the effects of the pandemic and to save lives and build their economies. As the African Union chair currently, South Africa has also assumed the challenging goal of silencing the guns in Africa. The United Nations Charter makes provision, as does the AU Protocol, for closer cooperation between the United Nations and the various regional organizations. We have to continue our efforts at strengthening cooperation among these organs and ensuring that each of them illustrates the strength of multilateralism and the strength of the United Nations as our global body. We should ensure that our efforts are coordinated, are complementary, and are mutually reinforcing. We still wish to argue for permanent representation of Africa in the Security Council. We believe that it should be democratized and will continue to argue for concrete negotiations toward its democratic reform. We believe that we now have a unique opportunity to embrace Africa's long-term call for reform. We also believe that we should marshal all UN institutions to help the poorest and most marginalized of nations to fully implement the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly to ensure that we rebuild public health systems, human resource capacity in the health sector, access to education for girls who will now be denied educational opportunity given the massive economic impact in many countries. So as we commemorate the 75th anniversary, we close by reaffirming South Africa's commitment to the ideals and spirit of the UN Charter and to achieving a more just and equitable world, which we believe has to be founded on multilateralism and international cooperation. In our view, the United Nations remains the most effective means to meet our collective goal and to broaden the frontiers of human achievement and endeavor in our global community. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Minister Pandor. Thank you for that sobering call to action and also for reminding us about the virtues and ideals of the United Nations Charter, which we all need to live. Our next speaker on the panel is the United Nations Resident Coordinator, Ms. Nardos Bekele-Thomas, who did a short welcome a short while ago. Ms. Nardos Bekele-Thomas previously served as the Senior Director in the Office of the United Nations Secretary General in New York. She has also served as the UN Resident Coordinator and UNDP Resident Representative in Kenya and in Benin. Ms. Thomas Bekele holds a master's degree and a PhD candidate certificate in economic development from New York University. She has also worked extensively over the past 3 decades on issues around the promotion of trade and development in African countries. She's worked as a private sector policy advisor and has worked on numerous pro-poor programs looking at the social dimensions of development. Ms. Bekele-Thomas, we look forward to hearing your insights into multilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations is a uniquely placed organization, like the minister just alluded to. This institution has been the glue that has bound nations together, a peaceful outlet for national grievances, an impartial body for international disputes. No other organization in the history of human civilization has had the legitimacy, mandate for impact, and convening power of the United Nations. Despite, of course, like the minister articulated clearly, despite the many failures expressed in the growing inequality, poverty, hunger, armed conflicts, terrorism, insecurity, climate change, the unfinished decolonization and pandemics, with the poor left behind, people being forced to make dangerous journeys in search of refuge, migrants being exploited, the declaration by all nations last month at the GA vows to build back better after the pandemic and deliver a world that is more equal, peaceful, prosperous, and a world which protects the planet. We are not a perfect organization, as the ongoing process of UN reform acknowledges, and as the list of reform agenda tabled by our minister. We are the sum of 193 parts, our member states. COVID-19, ladies and gentlemen, has been the most potent pandemic since 1918. It has spread globally in months. It's a truly 21st century crisis. There is no hope of addressing this pandemic individually. There is no border that has prevented its spread. The only effective response is through multilateralism, international cooperation, and of particular importance is the ongoing development and equitable distribution of a vaccine, which the Secretary General coined it as the people's vaccine. COVID-19 reminds us of the interrelation of the goals of the SDGs. A single virus has impacted all the facets of our well-being, from our economies to health and education systems to gender and inequality. Reaffirming the UN's emphasis on the connection between the SDGs, we need to address the goals as a collective, which can only be achieved through multilateralism. To address the current and future threats individually, nationally, and globally, we need to focus on the technicalities of securing the future of us all, starting from the most vulnerable. It's abundantly clear that the Secretary General's statement that the developing world must have a far stronger voice in a global decision-making is essential to ensure our collective safety. As the world is beset by unprecedented threats, COVID-19 and climate change, biodiversity loss to a record level of inequality, a stronger commitment from member states to a rule-based order with the UN at its center is the only solution. Our existence is a recognition that multilateralism is the only option. The 2030 Agenda, as you know, compels the UN development system to make bold changes. The United Nations Reform Agenda is at the center of repositioning the UN to better support the implementation of the SDGs at a national level. For the past 2 years, we have been on a journey to deliver the United Nations that is called for by member states, centered on one country program, one budgetary framework, and one leader. These efforts are all aimed at bringing to the fore relevant UN capacities in an integrated way that adds value to national development efforts. As the United Nations Secretary General explains, the purpose of any reform in the is to best position the United Nations to deliver on humanity's boldest agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals. And we are grateful, Madam Minister, to your government for championing this reform. In South Africa, we have used multilateralism to express our solidarity. As the United Nations, we took a firm, unequivocal stance against the evil that was apartheid. That spirit has continued since. The United Nations in South Africa has been hard at work over this period to help the government and people of South Africa to combat the scourge of COVID-19. We have used our convening power to coordinate and collaborate with key partners, such as the diplomatic corps, private sector, and civil society, through our global experience in coordinating humanitarian response efforts. We have also served as an important partner to national institutions and departments, as well as non-governmental organizations leading the humanitarian response, like the Solidarity Fund and the Department of Health and Social Development. In partnership with civil society, private sector, and our development partners, and under the leadership of the government, synchronized with the National Development Plan, we're ready to accompany the government in its journey of building back better. Our cooperation framework document, covering 5 years with a total budget of 600 million, will be officially signed and launched in November. We thank the leadership of DIRCO and the tireless task team led by Cedric Crowley from DIRCO. Ladies and gentlemen, the declaration adopted at the 75th sitting of General Assembly by member states recommitted and acknowledged that what we do today will affect the sustainability of our planet, as well as the welfare of generations for decades to come. Through reinvigorated global action and by building on the progress achieved in the last 75 years, we are determined to ensure the future we want and the UN we need. To achieve this, we will mobilize resources, strengthen our efforts, and show unprecedented political will and leadership. We will work together with partners to strengthen coordination and global governments for the common future of present and coming generations. As the world and South Africa emerges from the crisis, and we will prevail, it is essential that we build back better, that we learn from our mistakes. Our priorities are aligned, as the SG has urged, to the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Climate Agreement, and gender equality and parity. No country truly benefits from strife in the long term. We are all interconnected by our shared needs, desires, and humanity. I would like to leave you with words of our Secretary General, who envisaged a new global deal based on a fair globalization, on the rights and dignity of every human being, on living in balance with nature, on taking into account the rights of future generations, and on success measured in human rather than economic terms. I thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Resident Coordinator, Ms. Bekele Thomas, and also for reminding us on the need to stay focused on the Sustainable Development Goals despite the setbacks of COVID-19. Thank you for your comments. Our next panelist is Professor Tawane Kupe, the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Pretoria. The University of Pretoria of Tshwane, and we're very honored that you've been able to join us, Professor Kupe. Your institution has worked for many years very closely with both DIRCO and the United Nations system in South Africa. So we're really pleased that you could join us this morning. Professor Kupe holds an honors and a master's degree in English from the University of Zimbabwe and a DPhil in media studies from the University of Oslo, Norway. He has an extensive publication record and serves on the board of several civil society organizations. Professor Kupe is also a regular commentator in the media and has an extensive publication report, often focusing on issues around media and how journalism functions and is portrayed. Professor Kupe, we very much look forward to hearing your insights, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudesh, and good morning, colleagues, and good morning, everyone. Honorable Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor, esteemed alumnus of the University of Pretoria, it's always good for me as Vice Chancellor to share a platform with the alumnus of the university. Ms. Bekele Thomas, who has visited the university recently with her team from the United Nations organizations, of which we are collaborating closely with, and Elizabeth Cideropolis, Chief Executive of South African Institute of International Affairs, my ex-colleague at WITS. I'm very glad to be at this meeting this morning because we are one of 3 universities that is surrounded by UN agencies, as well as some of the largest diplomatic missions in the world after Washington. And of course, DIRCO is a key institution of the state in our city, Tshwane. So for us, multilateralism is something that we see, experience, and live on a daily basis. And I'd like to make 2 propositions without repeating what the Honorable Minister and Ms. Bekele said about multilateralism. Multilateralism is not an option. It is the only option for the sustainability of humanity and the environment. So if you look across all of the agencies and the architecture of the UN, They are actually designed to sustain our humanity and our humaneness, if you like, but also to actually to also sustain in a sense, sustain or ensure that there's harmony between humanity and the environment. So the Human Climate Conference and its declarations are important in that regard. Second, when it comes to the United Nations, I think I'll make bold to say that if the United Nations did not exist, the world would have to create the United Nations, precisely because also it is, if you like, the only option to ensure a multilateralism that affirms the sustainability of the idea of being human and the sustainability of our environment. Third, I also like to say that the media and journalists in general do not give enough credit to the achievements of the United Nations. They tend, I think, to focus on the weaknesses of the United Nations or on the power dynamics and on the very fact, as the minister said and Ms. Bekele Thomas alluded to, that it does, like any institution, require some reforms to keep up with changing dynamics in international relations. That is not a monopoly of the United Nations. All multilateral organizations require reform. The World Bank requires reform. The IMF requires reform. The World Trade Organization requires reform, and perhaps even in the manner in which sometimes it seeks to choose its leaders when it is obvious who should be chosen. And one could go on in that direction. So the very fact that you have a multilateral institution with flaws, it should not blind you to actually its benefits and how, while focusing on reforming it, you should actually retain the best of its elements in order to advance the idea of humanity. Then I'd like to end also, of course, and today I deliberately wore, for those who can see, my lapel of the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them. This is very, very important. The global development agenda and social justice and human rights cannot be achieved by them being pursued by individual nations or regions of the world. Global social justice and human rights and equity and equality in economic development is a global agenda and must be driven globally, if you like. Let me just explain this a little bit. By talking about the notion of globalization, we've seen waves of globalization in past decades, and some might say even in past centuries. Some forms of globalization have privileged certain nations that have been privileged, for example, by developments like slavery, colonialism, and so on and so forth. That kind of globalization is anti-human, it is anti-social justice, it is responsible for violations of multiple human rights, and often has fueled wars within nations and across nations, and wars which the United Nations ideally would not like to see actually happen. So we need a humane globalization. And the humane globalization is based on an architecture of human rights that privilege social justice, equality of gender equality, and equality of regions in the world, equality of the people of the world, and also the prudent, just, and if you like, sustainable use of its resources. So that is very, very important going forward. I think the COVID pandemic provides some very interesting context. First, I think it has demonstrated how interconnected the world is. So a tiny gem is spread across the world, striking havoc to families, societies, economies, countries, regions, and health systems of the entirety of the world. In fact, the little virus has, in essence, pushed back everyone almost into their national boundaries through lockdowns, which were very important to achieve certain things. But you can see how a small virus, which knows no borders and knows no boundaries, can actually shut down the world, the entirety of the world. So it is as if COVID-19 has told us, you are one world, actually, and I will deal with you, actually. But this requires a global response as well. And who has come to the party by the World Health Organization, and I'll come to that in a short while. The pandemic struck the world also at a time when the rule-based multilateral order was already facing several threats. The Honorable Minister and Ms. Bekele Thomas mentioned some of the threats. I see in the audience today is my esteemed colleague, Professor Christo Haynes, who is at our Center for Human Rights at the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria. He spent many years representing South Africa at the UN Human Rights Commission. And he knows, and he has contributed to many, if you like, rules-based human rights both framework that, if adopted by the rest of the world, would create a more just, a more humane world. But all of these things have under threats, and sometimes fueled by the selfishness of certain nations' global interests and advancing certain perspectives over the collective interests. I won't go too much about that. The greatest threat has come from the rise of chauvinistic nationalism and unilateralism across the world, including major Western powers, and rising power, and also the countervailing, sometimes rising power of the global south. So, the global south is also set to assert, because it is a legitimate part of our humanity, and often the largest part of, in population terms, our humanity. To say the global power structure ought to be, as the minister said, democratized, not to the interest of the global south, to the interest of our common humanity, which is at the core of what the United Nations represents. Many responses to COVID-19 have reinforced growing nationalism, with states responding to the spread of the novel coronavirus by closing borders. I'm not saying that was totally wrong. It was legitimacy sometimes as a control measure to close borders. But when you close borders and begin to ban international movement of students, academics, professionals, and people as well, you're going beyond what you need to do to control the COVID-19. You're actually beginning to assert a form of nationalism that could breed terrible things that are anti-human: xenophobia, hatred of the foreign and the other, and othering others, and so on, and restricting international trade, even in its unreformed form, but important nonetheless, and defaulting on their international commitments. Yet the best responses to the pandemic come from effective international cooperation with countries across the globe collaborating in knowledge and information sharing. I think media has played a good role in that regard. The development and distribution of medical equipment and the development of vaccines and therapeutic treatments, I think that has been good. You saw, and I think the media highlighting the daily World Health Organization press conferences, for example, has been a huge antidote to to what is called fake news, which is really misinformation, propaganda, lies, unscientific information, and so on. The World Health Organization has been pivotal in these multilateral efforts. And the World Health Organization, no one in this audience needs to be reminded, it's an agency of the United Nations. And so imagine we didn't have the UN and the World Health Organization with a pandemic of this nature, would have been in a bad place. Africa mounted a strong multilateral response to the pandemic through the African Union under the chairperson of President Cyril Ramaphosa. The African Union has played several functions in coordinating the continent's response to COVID-19, coordination and standard setting, organizing regular meetings between political leaders, and forming the African Coronavirus Fund. That fund was also very interesting because it used also eminent Africans under diaspora. That actually diasporas are an interesting manifestation of multilateralism. So citizens of nations who have gone elsewhere in the world, coming back, and their skills, as President Ramaphosa has used eminent citizens to actually mobilize funds and mobilize the fight against the coronavirus. Only under a multilateral situation does that movement of people enable nations to actually cut across borders and cut across boundaries. Providing expertise, the Africa CDC is providing strategies, data, and training to AU member states. And the Africa CDC collaborates strongly with the World Health Organization, using its guidelines, information sharing, research, and so on. Technical support, Africa CDC leading expansion of testing capacities. public agenda setting, Africa CDC and other AU institutions running information campaigns through social media, podcasts, leaflets to inform citizens about preventing and treating COVID-19. Again, using UN World Health Organization's guidelines, adapting them to local contexts and understanding the local manifestation, but on a global framework that is science-based, but also sensitive to regional nuances. Fighting also misinformation and fake news and mobilizing resources. The AU Peru contributed 12.5 million to the African Coronavirus Fund. The AU also led the establishment of the Africa Medical Supplies Forum. I think there are future challenges. The minister touched on it, but allow me. The IMF, which also needs its own reform, has actually pointed out that the challenges we need to face future is that economic growth, especially there will be a decline in economic growth or lack of economic growth in GDP in 2020, and a weaker than expected economic rebound in 2021. Now, we all know that economic growth and GDP are not the best measures of the economic health, if you like, and economic prosperity of everyone in society. Economic growth and GDP often perhaps are good measures of those that are more privileged in the capitalist system and others, if you like, but are an important element of sustaining economies. The IMF has emphasized that the uncertainty surrounding its projections is, quote, unusually large, close quote, because the public health and economic factors remain difficult to predict. A resurgence of the virus, slow progress in developing vaccines and treatments, and inequitable global access to the latter could slow economic activity in the medium term. You know, one of the more, in my view, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, if there was a closer cooperation between, say, the IMF, the World Bank, World Trade Organization, that actually could, because the IMF does talk about inequitable global access, but the IMF necessarily does not deal with inequitable global access. Some might say some of its prescriptions, in fact, exacerbate global inequitable global access, and that the IMF, the World Bank, and so on are often under the control of some nations that are not always happy to practice multilateralism. I don't need to mention names. In this context of uncertainty, cooperation between states will be pivotal to mitigating further global economic crisis. So UNDP and other UN agencies would play a much more humane and much more equalizing role in this regard. The UN Secretary General was the speaker at the Nelson Mandela lecture in July 2021. And he said the following: we are sometimes told a rising tide of economic growth lifts all boats, but in reality, rising inequality sinks all boats. Now we need a reversal of this situation, and globalism or multilateralism of the humane kind is what we need. And the Secretary General then made a call for the following: a new global deal based on a fair globalization, on the rights and dignity of every human being, on living in balance with nature, on taking account of the rights of future generations, and on success measured in human rather than economic terms to shape a more equitable, just, and prosperous post-COVID-19 world. I mean, also, I think that is, if you know, that is actually the vision of the Sustainable Development Goals. It is exactly the way that the UN Secretary General paints it. At the UN General Assembly last month, world leaders echoed the importance of a more united nations as the most effective mechanism to address global threats and ensure global prosperity. I think that affirmation was very, very important at the anniversary of at the 75th anniversary of the UN. And here, I think again, to my colleagues in the media, they forget the following: is that, you know, we haven't had another world war, and there could also easily have been one if we didn't have the United Nations. Yes, we have wars that we should not have, some that, and I don't want to minimize their devastation, but a third world war in the current context would be totally devastating to humanity, as it is already devastated by other things, the pandemic included. Therefore, we need to lay the foundations in the present to enable a resilient, equitable future based on globalism. Now to my last remarks, building back better post-COVID-19. I think we should renew our commitment and to implementation of SDGs. We are now in the last decade of the SDGs. I was fortunate to be one of the vice chancellors and presidents of universities. I think the 100 were chosen by the UN Secretary General. 2 months ago, we had the SDN Sustainable Development Network Summit. The Secretary General addressed it. Ambassador Amina Mohammed chaired as the proceedings on the first day. The idea was how do we have a decade of advocacy for the SDGs, and what will be the role of universities? I think universities have an important role to play in promoting multilateralism. After all, the knowledge and skills they produce know no borders and boundaries. And correctly deployed and responsive to global and societal challenges, universities can make a great difference to the agenda of the United Nations through providing its expertise, like my colleague, Professor Christo Hens, sitting in this audience today. This expertise and knowledge he provided to the United Nations on the back of South Africa's success in the constitution it has, which is human rights based and promotes human rights. Yes, there are values, and we have not yet achieved those on the ground, but we have a beacon upon which we can use, in a sense, to achieve that. So we at the University of Pretoria, as one of the top research universities, are focusing on developing quality, relevant, and impactful research to address the challenges facing South Africa, the Global South, and the world. We particularly emphasize the theme-based research aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, South Africa's National Development Plan 2030, and the AU's Agenda 2063. We have the honor of hosting South Africa's Sustainable Development Goals Hub, which connects policymakers with the best South African research on the SDGs. So we also, I think, on behalf of the UN, hosting the hub for impact hub for Sustainable Development Goal 2. Our researchers work closely with the United Nations Office in South Africa, as well as with government and the diplomatic community, to develop collective solutions to the major challenges facing the world. I think a renewed multilateral effort to achieve the SDGs will be essential to building back stronger after COVID-19. COVID-19 is a setback for achieving the SDGs in 2030, but we mustn't give up. There are always setbacks in the development journey. It's never a straight line. Development is not a linear trajectory. It has all sorts of, but COVID-19, I think for me, is a moment of reimagining what we could do given the global threats that we could. So at the Association of University Vice Chancellors, I made a suggestion that we do research on reimagining South Africa's higher education system, and for each university to do that and to have a conversation with our African and global colleagues. So I attended a lot of webinars across the world around the idea of reimagining a higher education system that is more responsive to the real challenges on the ground of societies and the world. And instead of more the traditional elitist university in the ivory tower behind fences these days, and also all of its knowledge in journals and books. Journals and books are absolutely important as quality markers of knowledge, but they have to be translated into challenges facing society. And also, I think we have to ensure an equitable so-called fourth industrial revolution, which is really the benefits that should come from rapid technological change. The minister pointed out right now a huge the digital divide, and the COVID-19 exacerbated the digital divide and left many behind. And in the higher education sector, we have a slogan, no student left behind. But in reality, just for the 26 South African universities, some will not finish the academic year this year. Why? Because of the digital divide. Some will complete the academic year. And as we know, the future world of work requires some digital skills and access to digital technologies. So, and also global cooperation in the development of a vaccine and strengthening of the global health system is very, very important. Allow me, I think, to stop there. I have a few more points, but university professors can be undisciplined in taking up the time.
Thank you, Professor Cooper, for that. And thank you for also raising the critical issue of the digital divide and critically the role of media in this whole process. The issue of fake news is real, it's damaging. We have an infodemic as well as a pandemic, and you highlighted that very eloquently, so thank you. The United Nations actually has a campaign currently underway called Verified, which is a platform to assess the amount of fake news out there and how we can combat it. So thank you very much for that. Our last panelist is Ms. Elizabeth Cideropolis, the Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, Sire, an institution that's been around for nearly 100 years, I believe, with an extensive track record, and an institution that has worked very closely with the various United Nations agencies in South Africa and with DIRCO. Ms. Cideropolis has published extensively on various aspects of South Africa's foreign policy. She's the co-chair of the Think 20 Task Force on the G20, Development Cooperation, and the Sustainable Development Goals. Most recently, Ms. Cedaropolis has collaborated with scholars across 5 continents on the forthcoming Handbook on Development Cooperation for Achieving the 2030 Agenda, and has recently co-edited a volume entitled Values, Interests and Power, South African Foreign Policy in Uncertain Times, which was published just this month in October 2020. Ms. Cideropolis, we look forward to hearing your insights. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sedeshan. Honourable Minister, Ms. Bekele Thomas, Vice Chancellor Cooper, nice to see you again. Before I start, let me say to Minister Pandor that I was hoping to be able to welcome her physically to the Institute. But since this is a rather protracted pandemic, we will have to, I think, absolutely make do with a virtual arrangement. So I have my marching orders on that. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I cannot help but reflecting that 100 years ago, the world established the League of Nations. And 100 years on, we're not celebrating the League of Nations, we're celebrating the United Nations, because 25 years after the League of Nations was established and failed miserably to stop a Second World War, I think the founders of the United Nations and the drafters of the Charter actually learned a number of lessons from what had worked and not worked with the establishment of the League of Nations. And that's why we have a situation where 75 years on from the establishment of the UN, we're able to celebrate it. And 5 years ago, of course, we also celebrated what I thought was an amazing achievement of building consensus around the need to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and that those goals were essential for us both to protect the planet, but to protect us, protect development and seek prosperity. But things are, notwithstanding, I think, those very laudable achievements of the last 5 years, clearly multilateralism has been under threat for some time. And I think if there is any example, any better example of why multilateralism is important, I think the way in which the African Union, under the chairmanship of President Ramaphosa, responded to COVID-19 actually highlights why multilateralism, why international cooperation is so important. Because while we set off from a vulnerable position, I think coordination actually gave us strength. So the ultimate objective of multilateralism is to foster international cooperation governed by a set of rules and institutions that ensure an orderly set of relations for the ultimate objective, which we dare not forget, of advancing the welfare of the world. Minister Pandor and Ms. Bekele Thomas, as well as Prof. Cooper have referred to that. It's about peace and security. It's about development, health, social justice. Because at the basic unit of what we're trying to achieve in multilateralism is the people. And that, of course, is the preamble to the UN Charter, which we dare not forget either. You know, we the peoples of the United Nations. But I think it's important to reflect a little bit on why is multilateralism ailing? You know, is it a particular president and his engagement over the last 4 years? Is it the rise of new powers that want to upend the system? Is it the institutions that simply require a bit of fiddling with their structure? Or is it something much more substantial? Is it that the institutions are no longer fit for purpose because the underlying assumptions and values and interests that led to their establishment 75 years ago have been overtaken by a new societal, economic, and political set of realities? And I would argue that that is something that we need to reflect on, and I think some of the conversations this morning refer to it. The liberal international order was founded on a set of values and assumptions about the way the world works, about who should be at the top of the food chain, increasingly contested, particularly after its heyday at the end of the Cold War, so in the period of the 1990s and early 2000s. And clearly much has changed since then. So you have a backlash against globalization, and Prof. Cooper alluded to that just now. The global system of rules has been unable to ameliorate globalization's worst excesses, giving rise to nativist and chauvinist responses that argue that to protect themselves, they need to turn away from cooperation and interdependence. So both capitalism and a democracy that is beholden to, let's call them corporate interests, require an overhaul. It's about social justice and social inclusion, and right now where there is a massive gap there. There is also, very importantly, the absence of a compelling narrative by political leaders to their populations and to the global community to counter the rhetoric of insular, protectionist, nativist perspectives on the world. You know, we are rational beings, but we actually respond much better to storytelling. And have we been able to really make a compelling narrative for why this turn towards nativism, chauvinism, doesn't actually work? There are also clearly changing perspectives on how the world should be managed with the rise of emerging and developing countries. And that there needs to also be a recognition that in terms of the global rules, there isn't just one orthodoxy, one path to achieving development or prosperity. And so the global institutions need to be framed in such a way that recognizes this, rather than creating sort of straitjackets. There are clearly different interests, there are different values. Institutions currently are not able to accommodate or accommodate insufficiently. And that's not necessarily the UN, the civil servants who work, the international civil servants who work in the UN, because ultimately the UN is made up of member states. And I think as member states, you take responsibility for it. Another dimension which I think has to feed into the mix about how we reform and how we improve multilateralism is the fact that we have a growing complexity of actors at sub-state and non-state levels who are growing in prominence, but even more importantly, if you look at it in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, actually have a key role to play in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And so how do they become much more involved in the global governance frame that at this point in time, largely and for understandable and good reasons, is embedded in the nation state? The fear I have at this particular juncture is that if the current multilateralism is unable to reform, is not allowed to reform, then those who have sought to make changes to it will also increasingly explore other options. This thing about we try internal reforms, but if this isn't working, we're going to try external options, try new institutions, even complementary maybe, but also in parallel. And so this fragmentation does not really bode well for being able to mobilize collectively to tackle climate change, global pandemics, and achieve the SDGs. So to get that collective action right, and collective action not in a fragmented way. And I think here it's also important to note the issue of sometimes what people regard as mutually exclusive, you know, sovereignty and international cooperation or multilateralism. It's not mutually exclusive. Sovereignty is important, but like globalization, I would argue it needs to be tamed if the imperative to build back better is achieved, because building back better is also about pooling sovereignty and compromising and recognizing that this is not only about those at the top of the mountain, but also those at the bottom. I think that point that Minister Pandor made right at the beginning about the most vulnerable, who this pandemic has highlighted so pointedly, are affected by these global inequalities. So what we see emerging then at this point in time, which we have to engage with, is this multi-level multilateralism and ad hoc multilateralism, a multilateralism a la carte. So you have more coalitions of the like-minded or the willing on specific issues, whether that is on digital regulations or peace and security in particular parts of the world outside of the UN framework, arrangements which foster maybe perhaps voluntary codes of conduct. You have the minilaterals and the plurilaterals. Some also, and I think that is important, take the form of regional multilateralism, and that can augment global multilateralism, and I think it needs to be encouraged, and also the way in which we're engaging as an African Union. But there are other types that actually undermine universal participation, and I think we need to on tackling that. So in this interregnum, and I'm sort of coming to an end, I know we're running out of time, we have a number of initiatives that are emerging that might lead to, say, a new multilateralism. A new multilateralism will need to deal with globalization, because building back better implies societal resilience. And societal resilience is not just a domestic level problem or responsibility. It also fundamentally refers to and reflects the superstructure, the global structure of rules that govern the global economy. And if it's just the case that we think that poverty is an outgrowth only of poor domestic policies, and so we only have to engage at the national level, I think the fact is we will never undertake some of the reforms that are so essential to level the playing fields, whether these are in financial regulations, whether they're in trade, whether they're in digital regulations. And these are a lot of the issues that also South Africa has been taking up at various fora, not least, of course, in the G20. The global pandemic then is an opportunity to build back better, not only our lives, but the systems that govern it, because I think the two are interrelated. But I think we need to be very careful not to believe that because it's a crisis, this will really spur us on to do things in a different way. If we look at history, we see that there are lots of crises in history, but only few such crises actually lead to proper transformation. And those really relate to planning and power. If you don't have that, it all kind of dissipates. So without agreed on plans for what sort of new order should replace the old one, let's call them opposition movements collapse into infighting, and discontent peters out. And if such plans are not championed by a political force with the power to implement them, or to bring people together in the context of global governance, to get people around a common idea moving forward in the way we manage with the SDGs, then we revert to the status quo. So COVID does not mean that we will all immediately see the light of international cooperation and clamber onto the same train. But I think there is a specific role for countries such as South Africa and others who are committed to multilateralism, who are strong proponents of the UN, albeit recognizing that it has to be reformed. I think we have a particular role in engaging, in developing coalitions, yes, the pluri or the minilateral, developing coalitions of like-minded countries to influence the trajectories of these various ad hoc laterals, what I call ad hoc laterals, to strengthen international coordination, to augment the system, the UN system that underpins it, rather than undermine it. And we need to work on multiple levels to ensure that building back better then happens over the next 10 years, so that 10 years from now we can celebrate the achievement of the SDGs, not the partial achievement as we had to do with the Millennium Development Goals. Let that also, in the same way that the League of Nations should be a lesson to reflect on what didn't work there, let's also reflect on what didn't work entirely in the Millennium Development Goals. And let's get SDG 17 in particular, the means of implementation, working properly, particularly in this post-COVID world. But I think it's fundamentally about countries like South Africa and other non-state actors and sub-state actors building coalitions of consensus to move some of these forward at the global level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cideropolis, and also for emphasizing the significance of social justice and social inclusion, which sometimes gets omitted in the discourse. Also for remembering the League of Nations and where it failed, and a reminder that many have predicted the demise of the United Nations for 75 years, and 75 years later, the institution is still here, as has been described by a former Secretary General, an imperfect but a necessary institution. So thank you for that. Attendees, we are near the end of the session. I know Minister Pandor has other meetings, everybody else has a lot to get to, but we have just two questions, actually 2 or 3 short questions that have been sent to us through the social media channels, which I will pose in a minute, specifically to some of our panelists. Before I get to that, there's a message here from the Ambassador of Portugal to South Africa, His Excellency Manuel Carvalho, and he's asked us to just read it. It's very brief. And he says, in the 75 years we have had the UN, there was not any direct war between major powers. In that period, the world achieved the biggest peaceful transformation in history. We were 68 countries, and most of Africa and Asia were colonies. Today, we are 195 states, encompassing the diversity of 5 continents, all represented at the UN. For around 90% of humankind, hunger is now a bad memory from the past, and the UN is in the front line of combating what remains of that tragedy. The UN upholds the values for the future of humankind, including human rights, development, environmental protection, sustainability, equality, non-discrimination, for a better world. Congratulations to the UN on its 75th anniversary. Thank you very much, Ambassador Carvalho, for that. There's a question here that's been addressed to Minister Pandor, and I'll read it now. It says, South Africa has once again played an important role on the United Nations Security Council. As you yourself said, Minister Pandor, the Council still reflects the balance of power that existed in 1945. How do you think it needs to be reformed while upholding its most vital task of continuing to prevent conflict? And that's a question to Minister Pandor.
Well, thank you very much for that question. Well, we have, as Africa, mapped out our belief in the Ezulini consensus. We believe that Africa should have some permanent seats within the Security Council if it retains the current model. We also believe that we should find ways in which the more general membership of the United Nations plays a role in the core decision-making of the organization, but essentially in the makeup of the Security Council, we need to see greater changes and much more deliberate attention to ensuring that the Security Council is empowered through regional collaboration to intervene decisively and speedily in conflicts in different parts of the world, that it is able to move in a very nimble way to ensure that initial outbreaks of conflict do not then become much larger regional civil areas of conflict. So it's really reforming the Council, making it more democratic, more inclusive, and ensuring that it focuses on the agenda of peace and security and advancing democratization throughout the world. From time to time, the so-called P5, the influential members that are permanent, have really, I think, place their stamp and character on the Security Council, sometimes to its detriment. It has to be a council that reflects the core ethos and value of the organization and not that of a very powerful group of countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Pandor, for your response there. The next question is addressed to the UN Resident Coordinator, Ms. Nardos Bekele-Thomas, and it reads, pre-1994 and in the early years of democracy, the United Nations support to South Africa was dominated by a human rights agenda. As we emerge from COVID-19, how do you think the United Nations can strengthen the human rights agenda in terms of multilateralism? That's the question for the UN Resident Coordinator.
Thank you very much. I think, UN's support to the government is based on, certainly on human rights. It's not just the political rights, but also social rights, economic rights, and these are indivisible. And therefore, all what we are doing is really to strengthen the rights of individuals and also the freedoms of individuals in the country. And as we go on, for example, in our work, the foundation of our work is based on human rights. Everything that we do is really founded on human rights. And we, in all our works that we do, certainly, based on the SDGs and based on the National Development Plan, we strengthen, the inclusive growth in this country so that we tackle and we support the government in terms of tackling inequality in this country, in terms of tackling unemployment in this country, in terms of tackling poverty in this country, which we call the triple challenges. We do that through our own results groups, which we have established, and you will be seeing a lot of these results groups work as we go on, because under the leadership of the government, we'll be reviewing our programs in a very transparent and accountable manner with civil society, private sector, the academia and research institutions participating in this, meaning that the whole ecosystem will be reviewing our program with the spirit of our support being the support that we give to the government. And we don't have any program, but we support the government's program. The government is, the owner and the leader of our program, and we have to know that. And therefore, what I want to say is that all what we are doing is really making sure that, the human rights of individuals, be it social, economic, cultural, and political, and the freedoms, the larger freedoms, the freedom to choose, the freedom from want, are really secured for individuals, for vulnerable groups, and those that were marginalized and suffered from, the past historic injustices.
Thank you very much, Resident Coordinator. And the last question is actually being posed to both Professor Cooper and Ms. Cideropolis, so I would ask that they be answered individually. And this is the question. There is much talk about the notion of building back better. What do you think should be the United Nations' top 3 global priorities once we emerge from COVID-19? And if I could ask Professor Cooper to answer the question first, and I'll repeat it. There is much talk about building back better. What should the United Nations' top 3 global priorities be once we emerge from COVID-19? And I'll ask Professor Cooper to answer briefly, and then Mr. Cideropolis to answer briefly, and we'll conclude. Thank you.
I think one of not unsurprising, given where I work in my daily job, building equitable quality education, which includes actually global digital access, because this is not actually difficult. In my field in journalism and media studies, we explore quite a lot that public digital infrastructures that enable everybody to go online are actually possible. That means a partnership between government, academic institutions, and the private sector. We did it in South Africa recently, but I don't have time to do it to detail that. So, but quality education that is equitable, access for all, no child left behind from early childhood all the way to university. Second, gender equality. I think that, as the minister correctly said, one of the worst impacts of COVID-19 was on women at the margins, but I would say, as is usual in all our patriarchal societies, on women in general. Because on the basis of that, the third thing for me is building an equitable economic system. Because quality education, gender equality, building an equitable economic system will also are interlinked and interrelated.
Thank you, Professor Cooper. Thank you for that response. And Ms. Cideropolis, if you can answer that, the same question, I will read it again. There is much talk about building back better. What should the United Nations' top 3 global priorities be once we emerge from COVID-19?
Firstly, I will echo what Professor Cooper has said about the importance of education, but I would add an additional point here that if there is one thing that we've learned from COVID is how important it is to build up cooperative research and innovation. And here I would say this is one of the priorities for Africa specifically. And I know that this is something that is close to the minister's heart as well in terms of a previous portfolio. So that's the first. Relatedly, of course, really a focus on building in vulnerable societies, building up the public health systems. And it's the systems. It's not just targeted, siloed interventions. It's building up the entire system, because that way it is much more resilient. And then lastly, is the importance of using the huge amount of money that has been mobilized, this fiscal stimuli, to act in a proper transformation to the green economy, bearing in mind how it affects vulnerable people. But I think this is now a golden opportunity to actually begin to tackle some of the climate change objectives that we have set up in a really sustainable and concerted way.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those remarks. Attendees, we have had 1 or 2 questions on the chat box, but we can, some of it is related to what has been asked already. So as we conclude, if I could ask each of the panelists to just deliver a short closing remark, perhaps a call to action, an inspiring message for the next 75 years, and then we will conclude the session. If I could ask Minister Pandor to deliver a few closing remarks.
Well, thank you very much. I think all of us desire a world that is prosperous, one in which everyone has a basic livelihood, where all persons enjoy access to justice and human rights. And we have institutions of the United Nations dedicated to all these ambitions. So I believe as we enter the post-pandemic world, we need to examine how each of the UN institutions can be supported to execute their role to support the most vulnerable and marginalized to enjoy all these wonderful rights that we talk about. So how do we use the strength of the UNDP, of UNICEF, of all the institutions of the United Nations to make a difference to those who need support a great deal? That, I believe, should be our agenda. And if it be that it is 40 countries whose most vulnerable we've addressed, that minimal agenda will be an important achievement. We need to be focused. We cannot do everything, but we must do something, and we can change the world together. I believe this is really the message I'd love to leave. And I thank everybody for the wonderful statements that have been made. And I wish you well in the rest of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Pandor. UN Resident Coordinator, Ms. Nardos Thomas, your closing remarks.
Thank you very much. I think, if there is one thing or 2 things that I would like to say is that, first of all, the United Nations is not, the international civil servants that we are paid to do, the work that we love to do. We're just blessed to be here. The United Nations international civil servants are really at the disposal of the government and the people of the country. Second is partnership. We cannot do anything without partnership. We need the civil society organizations, which are our close partners, but we need the business community. We need also the research institutions and also the universities, learning institutions. We would like to see, as the Professor Coupe said, these institutions, both research and learning institutions, to be relevant to the socio-economic transformation process of this country, because without them building the fabrics for this transformation, the country will not go anywhere. We need also the private sector because we need resources. Government alone cannot do it. Private sector should participate, understanding the fact that they are building a base of their consumers. They're expanding their economies. And in the expansion of the economies, we need to make sure that we have got increased number of stakeholders in the economy. The economy should not be monopolized by very few, but it should be broad-based. And therefore, youth employment is critical and very important. Women engagement in economic empowerment is critical and very important. We need really certainly, like Minister, you started by saying, we need to be serious about women empowerment in general. It's not just a silo activity here and there. And therefore, we are establishing what we call, a sort of a platform for knowledge building in South Africa. And one of the platforms is gender platform. And this gender platform is intended to bring all those that are active in economic empowerment, but also in gender responsive programs to be together, interrogating all our programs and making sure that there is a scorecard for each and every activity that the government has put in place in its strategy. So we are going to do this for the youth. We're going to do also this for the social protection, using our convening power. And we are so lucky to be in a country where the UN is respected and given a space to do all what it is created to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Resident Coordinator. And closing remarks now from Professor Tawane Coupe.
Three things really that I would like to say. Three things that I would really like to say. COVID has sparked a generational crisis and revealed pre-existing. COVID didn't cause all of these things. They were pre-existing. Deep fault lines and fragilities in our societies and across the world. However, I sincerely believe that COVID also presents a unique opportunity to discard our old stale beliefs and practices to build a more peaceful, just and sustainable global economy and society. We can live in a better world. It is within us to do that. Third and last, universities must play a critical role in providing the transdisciplinary research and skills required to address complex, interconnected, global, and local challenges in order to bring forth a new and a better world.
Thank you, Professor Coupe. And finally, closing remarks from Ms. Elizabeth Cideropolis, Chief Executive of Sire.
So I thought I'd end with the preamble to the UN Charter. And I have it before me. It says, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom." That's what the SDGs are about. That's what the UN is about. I think the UN, and this is a comment to you, I think the story is being told The UN story is being told. The work that the international civil service is doing has been told, but we probably need to tell it better, and we need to get member states to be telling that story better. I think that's the challenge that we face in terms of highlighting why multilateralism and international cooperation are so important. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I think that is a very fitting and inspiring way to end it. Yes, I think the sadness of virtual meetings is we can't get the rah-rah going. Thank you very much, Cideropolis, for that. And attendees, that brings us to the conclusion of this morning's session. I'd like to acknowledge all those who made it possible, the teams from DIRCO and the United Nations office in South Africa. I'd like to acknowledge the Public Diplomacy Unit at DIRCO, the team at the United Nations Information Center, the Office of the Resident Coordinator, and the UN Communication Group, as well as the IT teams at both DIRCO and the UN, without whom none of this is possible. And of course, to our panel, thank you for illuminating us on the importance of multilateralism in building back better for a post-COVID world. You candidly laid out what we need to secure the future we want and the UN we need. To Minister Pandor, to UN Resident Coordinator Nardos Thomas, Professor Coupe, and Elizabeth Cideropolis, thank you so much for sharing your time. You've all been pulled in many directions at this juncture, and we really do appreciate it. To all our attendees, and there were over 100 from the Government of South Africa, Diplomatic Corps, research and academic institutions, and members of the media, thank you for your time. And I will conclude with these words from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres very recently at the General Assembly just last month, when he reminded us that at its birth, the United Nations was a symbol of global unity. Today, it is the epicenter. Our mission is more important than ever. Thank you very much for your time and your engagement. Enjoy the weekend. Till next we meet. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly Thomas.
Thank you, Sudesh.
Thank you, RC, and thank you, everybody. Now we can enjoy the weekend.